Whenever I publish a video about the traditional Latin Mass, I always get comments sniping about the Latin language. They say things like, Jesus didn't speak Latin, or the Last Supper was in Aramaic, not Latin, or the earliest Christian liturgies in Rome weren't in Latin but Greek. The people who say such things mistakenly believe that the hubbub about the traditional Latin Mass is primarily about the Latin language. That is to say, they think trads are upset because we want more Latin. I'm reminded of a story I once heard about a well-known priest, a media personality, who was leading a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. One of the women going on the pilgrimage asked the priest if there would be an opportunity to attend any traditional Latin Masses in the Holy Land. The priest said there would not be, but he offered to accommodate the woman by saying some of the Novus Ordo Mass parts in Latin for her. That way, he said, she could, and I quote, hear some Latin. While it's right to commend this priest for his desire to make a pastoral accommodation for the woman, his reaction exemplifies the misunderstanding I am speaking of. The priest assumed the woman's desire for the Latin Mass was about hearing some Latin. And while he couldn't offer her the traditional Latin Mass, he could offer her some Latin as a consolation. The woman thanked the priest for his offer, but went on to explain that her desire for the traditional Latin Mass was about more than hearing Latin. And that is what I, too, would like to explain in this video, especially for the sake of you normies who seem to get tripped up by this. In a certain sense, I can understand why people think the Latin Mass is about Latin. After all, we call it the traditional Latin Mass, which may give the impression that the Latin language is what this Mass is all about. But that would be incorrect. Though the adjective Latin is often used to describe this Mass, there is so much more that makes it unique. By way of example, I have a brown leather belt that was passed on to me by my grandfather. It's very old, and it has sentimental value. I call it my brown leather belt, but you would be vastly mistaken to think that what makes this belt special is that it's brown or leather. Those are just descriptors by which I distinguish this belt from others. Similarly, the term Latin Mass is simply a descriptor to help distinguish the old Mass from the new. But ultimately, the fact that it is in Latin is not its most essential aspect. Now, don't get me wrong here. Latin is important. It's very important. And you don't have to take my word for it. Pope St. John XXIII, the father of the Second Vatican Council himself, praised Latin's utility for Catholic theology and worship, saying that Latin, quote, bears constant witness to the living voice of antiquity. Pope John also said that Latin was the ideal tongue to unify a multicultural church. John said, and I quote, of its very nature, Latin is most suitable for promoting every form of culture among peoples. It gives rise to no jealousies. It does not favor any one nation, but presents itself with equal impartiality to all and is equally acceptable to all. John XXIII also said Latin was the most perfect language for theology. He said, and I quote, the characteristic nobility of Latin is its formal structure, its concise, varied, and harmonious style, full of majesty and dignity, makes for singular clarity and impressiveness of expression. Finally, let's consider the following remarkable quote, wherein Pope John sums up his arguments for the value of Latin as a universal language fit for a universal church. He says, the Latin language can be called truly Catholic. It has been consecrated through constant use by the Apostolic See, the mother and teacher of all churches, and must be esteemed a treasure of incomparable worth. It is a general passport to the proper understanding of the Christian writers of antiquity and the documents of the Church's teaching. It is also a most effective bond, binding the Church of today with that of the past and of the future in wonderful continuity. The preceding citations in praise of Latin can be found in John the 23rd's encyclical Veterum Sapientia, issued in 1962, the same year the Second Vatican Council was convened. Clearly, the visionary Pope of Vatican II not only understood the value of Latin, but wished its use to be preserved, as did Vatican II itself, which taught in its constitution on the sacred liturgy, quote, "The use of the Latin language is to be preserved in the Latin rites." Sacrosanctum Concilium, paragraph 36. If, therefore, you are dumping on Latin liturgies or rejoicing in Latin's extinction, it is you who are going against the mind of the Council and the sainted Pope who called it. So please do not take this to mean Latin isn't important. It very much is, for all the reasons John the 23rd enunciated. But the Latin Mass is not only about Latin, it is about so much more. The traditional Latin Mass is the historic Mass, the Mass of Ages. Now, that does not mean it looked exactly the same in every period. Clearly, the Mass as celebrated in 6th century Rome would not be identical to the Mass celebrated in 11th century France, which would not be identical to the Mass celebrated in 16th century Germany. But they would be strikingly similar. In fact, probably more similar to one another than the 1969 Novus Ordo is to the 1962 Missal of John the 23rd. For the traditional Latin Mass was a rite whose growth was slow and organic over many centuries, developing the way a sapling grows into a mature tree. We can study the development of the Mass through missals and sacramentaries of different eras, comparing them to one another to see how Masses were celebrated in different times and places. While the traditional Latin Mass as celebrated today was not codified for the Latin Rite until 1570, historical texts show that the Mass had essentially reached its current form by the time of Gregory the Great in the late 6th century. Changes after this were minor. The Latin Mass thus represents at least 1,500 years of continuous, uninterrupted development, and its pre-Gregorian roots have been hypothesized, speculated, to go back to St. Peter himself, whom some scholars think could have been the author of the principal texts of the Roman canon. The point is that the traditional Latin Mass carries the entire institutional memory of the Church with it in a way that cannot be said of the Novus Ordo, which Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger called a banal, on-the-spot production. A product of committees, of bureaucratic fiat manufactured by the Vatican equivalent of a corporate focus group to encapsulate not the perennial tradition of the Church, but the time-bound pet concepts of a clique of 1960s ideologues. The resultant Novus Ordo Missae was thus not an organic development out of the preconciliar Mass. Indeed, Matthew Hazel's patient scholarship has demonstrated that only 13% of the texts of the traditional Mass made it into the Novus Ordo unaltered. The texts are different, the calendar is different, the orientation of the prayers is different, the ecclesiological vision is different. Clearly, this represents a contrasting vision of what the Church does in its official worship. If it did not, then why did the architects of the Novus Ordo feel the need to change or jettison 87% of the texts from the Old Mass? The fact is, the new liturgy was created specifically to accompany a new ecclesiological vision, a new theology. And this is not trad propaganda. This is what Cardinal Arthur Roche, prefect of the Dicastery of Divine Worship, has explicitly stated. Roche says, quote, "You know, the theology of the Church has changed. Whereas before, the priest represented at a distance all the people. They were channeled, as it were, through this person who alone was celebrating the Mass. But it is not only the priest who celebrates the liturgy, but also those who are baptized with him, and that is an enormous statement to make." The theology of the Church has changed, Cardinal Roche says, and this change is encapsulated in the rites of the new Mass. Now, I am not arguing, and I have never argued that the Novus Ordo Mass is not a valid liturgy. It is an officially promulgated liturgy of the Church and is a means of grace to those who assist at it with proper disposition. But it is an inferior expression of the Church's faith, and, more importantly, it is not the historic Roman rite. It is not the rite which has organically developed century after century, encapsulating the theology, spirituality, and piety of 2 millennia of Catholics. It is not the Mass that would have been recognizable to Pope St. Gregory the Great, nor heard by St. Francis. It is not the Mass celebrated by Aquinas, nor the Mass through which St. Therese of Lisieux was sanctified. Traditional Catholics are not wrong for wanting to access this esteemed treasure of incomparable worth, as Pope John XXIII called it. Why should we prefer Cardinal Roche's new theology to the Mass which has given us so many saints, nourished so many martyrs, which has, in fact, given the very definition to the Church's piety throughout the centuries? What was so rich and life-giving to one generation cannot suddenly be wrong in another. As Benedict XVI so eloquently said, quote, "What earlier generations held as sacred remains sacred and great for us too, and it cannot be all of a sudden entirely forbidden or even considered harmful. It behooves all of us to preserve the riches which have developed in the Church's faith and prayer, and to give them their proper place." Now, I am sure there will be some real big-brain folks listening to this who will respond, "If you love the tradition so much, why aren't you celebrating the way the apostles did? Why not go back to the Mass of the early Christians?" Look, tradition is not about going back as early as possible. That's why the Latin Rite doesn't do Mass in Aramaic or Greek. Tradition isn't about a false antiquarianism that says older is better just because it's older. Tradition is about receiving intact a heritage that was bequeathed to us, a heritage that developed over the centuries, carrying with it all the prayers and memories of each succeeding generation in unbroken ritual succession. We do not want the traditional Latin Mass because it's older. We don't want it so we can hear some Latin. We want it because it preserves our heritage in a way that the Novus Ordo does not. It's not about looking for the primitive Mass of the early Church. As St. John Henry Newman famously said, "They are ever hunting for a fabulous primitive simplicity. We repose in Catholic fullness." Now, this may not win you over to the Latin Mass, and that's okay. It wasn't meant to. But it is meant to disabuse you of the silly notion that the reason we want the Latin Mass is to hear Latin. I'd love to hear more Latin, but better still is to hear the Mass of my ancestors.